morning. Thanks for making it so early for a talk that's probably slightly different from what you've been seeing so far. I'm Yves-Alexandre de Montjoye. I'm a research scientist at the MIT Media Lab and a lecturer at Imperial College in London. And so today, what I want to really talk to you about is really this new field that we call computational privacy, and really more fundamentally how the way we behave as human really impacts what we can expect from a privacy perspective. So just every time before I start, I'd just like to make sure that we're on the same page. So every time I'm going to talk about data, big data, large-scale behavioral data set, what I really mean is these kind of data, large-scale data coming from your phone. This is traditional mobile phone metadata that thanks to someone in 2013, Snowden, we don't need to explain what it is anymore. These kind of data, search engine queries, this kind of data, credit card type data, and every other, basically sensor Internet of Things data sets that would record something about human behavior and the way we behave as a society. And why we're particularly excited about this kind of data is really because this is the best data we've had so far to understand human and societies at scale. People have been calling it the microscope, the telescope of the social sciences. New fields have been rising, like computational social science. And this is also the same data set that are being collected online or by your smartphone for commercial applications like Google Now, Netflix, Last.fm, any kind of recommendation system is really based on these kind of data. And what I really want to focus on here is really how can we start using this data in a way that is what we would call privacy conscientious. Is how can we use this data in a way that will not endanger people's privacy. And for that, doing research in this field, we really start to identify basically two main challenges to the use of this data in a privacy conscientious ways. And then I will talk to you about some of the solutions that we started to develop. So the first challenge is really the one that we call the limits of anonymization. And what this really means is that when you look at these kind of data sets, this is how it looks like, right? Location data, you carry your phone around pretty much 24/7 with you, and you generate these kind of data on Google Latitude. The exciting life of a graduate student at MIT, working from home, beer with a friend, lab, home, lab, you get the idea. And every time you look at these kind of data, it's always used anonymously. Right? You don't know who's behind this data. You don't know who generates this data. And most of the time when you use this data, it looks a lot more like this. And it's always used in a way that you can use this magic word that it's anonymous, right? We don't know who's behind. And in fact, this notion of anonymity has really been the cornerstone of data protection, right? That's kind of the magic tool that you use to take data that you might feel is fairly sensitive, is fairly individual, and so on and so forth, and suddenly you turn it into these large-scale aggregated data set that you can do all kind of cool things with. And I'm fast-tracking a little bit, basically just to make sure that we're on the same page. What I mean by data anonymization is really more like a two-step process. So basically, you take this data set and you want to do something with this data without endangering people's privacy. What you're going to do is basically first, you're going to start to remove everything that would be direct identifiers, right? Everything that would link one of these lines with a specific individual, phone numbers, name, credit card numbers, addresses, and so on and so forth. And this first step is called pseudonymization, right? So basically, you take all these direct identifiers and you remove them from the database. You don't need them anyways. And so that gives you a first step towards preventing an attacker to link this database or this data back to an individual. The issue is, and what we realized long time ago, 20 years ago, is that actually even when you look at these data and you remove the direct identifiers, you still have what we call indirect identifiers. Indirect identifiers are basically a piece of information that alone won't tell you anything about the individual, but when you start combining them together, might allow you to single out a single individual and to be able to re-identify the data set and find someone's income in this database. For example, because you know that the person you're searching for is a woman, was born in 1936 in January. There's one and only one person in this database that is a woman born in 1936, and then you can re-identify her and figure out what their income is. And really, the second step is what we call de-identification or anonymization. Basically, what we do is we're going to take these, indirect identifiers, and we're going to make them less precise, right? We're going to try to prevent this little game that I just explained to you by basically, trying to generalize a little bit this piece of information so that you can directly re-identify someone. So we're going to take, the date of birth, for example. I'm not going to give you the precise date of birth. Maybe I will only give you age group. And really, the second step is called generalization and suppression. And this is really, you remove direct identifiers, you remove indirect identifiers. And that's really the way so far, in the past 20 years, we managed to find this balance between privacy and utility, this balance between using this data for good and making sure that we're not risking people's privacy, and you can't re-identify one person in this data set. And so far, that has been built very deep in the law, both in the US and in Europe, as the way you turn personal data into non-personal data. And so that worked really well for quite a long period of time. The issue is, in the past, say, 5 to 10 years, we started to see a couple of examples of times in which this was not working anymore. So you had this example in 2006 where, AOL released a search query data set, and they removed all the direct identifiers, and then they put it online for anyone to download. And then at some point, they realized that there was one thing that did not think too much about is the way we behave and the way we do searches. And it turns out that people have this kind of bad habit of not only searching for fairly local informations, like restaurants near you and things like that, as well as often searching for themselves. And after, having put this data set online, suddenly they realize that there's a bunch of things that, actually allows you to re-identify people. They try to pull it out. I showed you the data set. It's still online. This was 10 years ago. The data set is still downloadable on BitTorrent. The second example was in 2008 was the re-identification of the Netflix dataset. Again, here Netflix took large-scale data sets, movie reviews, and wanted to put it online for anyone to try to compete in an algorithmic challenge, basically building a better recommendation system. Again, here they took a certain number of steps. There was no names. There was no Netflix ID. But again, humans. Basically here what happened is people have this very bad habit of watching a movie on Netflix, giving it 9 stars out of 10. This was a really good movie on Netflix, which was released by Netflix. And then go to IMDb and do the exact same thing, give it 4 stars out of 5. And the thing is, if you do that often enough, for one movie, for a second movie, for a third movie, pretty much at the same time, you can very easily link someone's identity on IMDb with, the so-called anonymous Netflix data set. And so, we had, after that, there was the same analysis was done on DNA. And so what we really wanted to do here is see the extent to which, there's basically 2 hypotheses, right? The first hypothesis, people who would defend anonymization will tell you, well, this is an example of someone screwing up, right? If we had known, if we had thought about it, if we had sit and all brainstorm and spend more time, we would have found a good solution. We would have prevented this re-identification from happening, and this is someone screwed up. Second hypothesis, which is the one we wanted to investigate, is really maybe there is something special with the kind of data set that I showed you at the beginning: search queries, location data, credit card data, sensor data. That basically means that anonymization might not be the best way to use this data in a privacy-conscientious way, and maybe anonymization doesn't work anymore. And for that, we developed what we call Unicity. So Unicity, basically, the goal is a metric that we came up with in which we basically try, instead of making assumption and trying to see, well, maybe there's IMDb, and maybe I can link it to the Netflix data set, and maybe people are searching for themselves, and so on and so forth. We basically try to quantify, on average, the risk of re-identification of a data set without making a hypothesis of what an attacker might or might not know. And basically, the way we do this is we look at number of points. And a point in our case would be like any piece of information that an attacker might know about you. So we're not trying to say, well, like, you might know the name, you might know the date of birth, but you will never know the income. We're like, this was maybe okay in the past, like, when it comes to location data, when it comes to like, basically a data point in like, one of these mobile phone data sets, there's absolutely no differences between a point, a piece of information that might be known by an attacker, and a piece of information that will be useful for you for the application you're looking at, recommendation system, any kind of data science application. And basically what we really try to do is to see, well, let's take the problem the other way around, and instead of like, trying to re-identify data set and make hypotheses on what an attacker might or might not know, why don't we just try to quantify on average, like, how many of these piece of information, any piece of information do we need to be able to uniquely re-identify someone? And so that's what we did with mobile phone data. We developed an algorithm basically to estimate unicity. So basically to estimate, if I were to try to re-identify you with high likelihood, like how many of these pieces of information do I need? Like, if I take a piece of information that would be location, I know that you were like, within this region of like, 1 kilometer square between 10 and 11 a.m., large scale data set, millions of people, how many of these points, places, and times do I need to know so that in the entire data set, there's one and only one person that was at these places at this time? Anyone wants to take a guess? Okay, so who think that we need, like, say 1 million people, 1 kilometer square, an hour resolution between 10 and 11 a.m., taken completely at random out of the data set? How many points do you think we need? So who think we need more than 10? Raise your hand. 10, 8, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Just for the one who haven't been followed, like this is really your last chance. Like, okay, let's say on average like 5, something like that. I mean, why don't we try? So basically, the main idea is really you take this data set, you take the way people have been behaving, moving around, and then there's a piece of information right? You know the person was at this place at this time, right? And so that basically allows you to remove from the data set all the people that were not, like, at this place or around this place at this time. And then basically what you do is you take the data set, you remove part of it, you remove part of it, you remove part of it. And as you can see, what's really interesting is despite very large scale data set, this is just a visualization, very quickly, the number of people that could be the person you're searching for is decreasing extremely fast. And in fact, in this case, it's decreasing fast enough that if you know 4 places and times, that was sufficient so that in this entire synthetic data set, there's one and only one person that was at these places at this time. And so that would mean that if you were to know these 4 pieces of information, on average, that would be sufficient for you to re-identify this person. And so this is just like a little video to get you a sense of the concept. But 4 is actually what you need. So what we did is we take a large-scale data set, mobile phone data, 1.5 million people over 15 months, and then we took these points completely at random. And basically what we were able to show is that if we know 4 of these places and times, on average, for any individual, that's enough to uniquely re-identify him 95% of the time. So really what this means is that 95% of the time, if you have, geolocated tweets, 4 of these tweets will be enough to uniquely re-identify someone in a large-scale mobile phone data set. It can be tweets, it can be Instagram, geolocated pictures. It can be restaurant reviews on Foursquare. I know that you were at this restaurant at this time. And really what this means, or any other piece of information you would know about the person, but really what this means is that order of magnitude, 4 places and times, is all you need to single out one individual in a large-scale data set of 1.5 million people. I think, should I take questions now, or do I take them? Sure, let's, I think it's going to be more fun, more interactive. Let's do it.
So just, do these 4 points in time need to be in some way sequential? Could they be over like a week's time?
Yeah, I mean, here the goal was really, this is very much like, it's very different from the way this has usually been approached. Like usually privacy is always like, you try to build these cases in which you can match one data set with the other and so on and so forth, kind of hacks. The goal here is really to try to quantify, right? Really the goal here is try to see like, all in all, order of magnitude, like what does it take? And so what we do here is we take them completely at random. We take like every single places you've been going to over like, 15 months. We take like 4 of them completely at random, and then we look at like, the extent to which these, like, you're the only person in the data set that was at these 4 places at these 4 times. What's really interesting though is that we try to see how the, like, basically the length of the time period in which we're taking the points actually impact unicity and the likelihood of re-identification. And what's really interesting is that, like, you pretty much stay with like 4 points at 95% up to a week. And then as soon as you start decreasing more than a week, then the likelihood of re-identification decreases a little bit, just because within a week, like, say that you and I would have been at the same place at the same time, like, we work together or something within the week, within 5 days, we are more likely to be at the same places at the same time. So the likelihood decreases a little bit if you really take them, like, within these 5 days, but very quickly then you see the behavior diverge.
In your current example, you're talking about location and time, and you have 4 observations over, say, 2 variables. Now, if you increase the number of variables, do those number of observations required actually decrease?
You mean augmenting the dimensionality of the points, or augmenting the number of points?
The dimensionality.
The dimensionality. Give me 1 second.
Okay, thank you.
So actually what's really interesting is with this example, right? It's like it can be Twitter, it can be geolocated pictures, it can be restaurant reviews. Actually, an interesting fact is that you take your phone and you go to a restaurant, right? And you eat. And then actually, at least in the US, 70% of the time, when you eat at a restaurant, you pay using your credit card or your debit card. And so what was interesting here is we wanted to see, well, like, we showed it with general location data, like every place you're going through your phone. The question we wanted to ask is, can we do the same thing with another data set, right? Like, to which extent is this, like, 4 points, something that's fairly general to human behavior, or is that something that's specific to mobile phone data with location? And so what we did is we took, like, this kind of data. I know that you were at a given place, you ate at a given restaurant, or you bought something at a given shop, and then we wanted to see again, like, how many of these, in this case, shops, and this, do I need to know to uniquely identify you, for example, in credit card data set, right? So I know that, like, my friend, Jean from Paris, was in this restaurant called L'Alsace on January 4th. And the question is, like, what's the likelihood of re-identification if I were to know 4 of these reviews? Like, he left like more than 100 of them. If I take 4 of them, what is the likelihood of re-identification? And actually, what's fascinating is that we show that it's pretty much the exact same thing. So basically, you take a large-scale credit card data set, in this case, 1.1 million people in an OECD country over 3 months. And basically, what we showed is that if you know 4 points, in this case, a restaurant or a shop, and a day, that's enough to uniquely identify someone 90% of the time. So 90% of the time, there's a lot of people who are, like, buying coffee at the same Starbucks as you do in the morning, but very few of them will then go eat at the same restaurant you will in the evening, and so on and so forth. And here again, 4 points, 4 shops, and this is enough to uniquely identify someone 90% of the time. And to answer your question on the dimensionality of the points, basically what we showed here is that not only we looked at the point. We look at a specific shop on a specific day. Actually, what we showed is that if I know on top of that what you bought at the shop, not even specific items, just I know that you bought one coffee, or you bought a pair of shoes, something between 50 and 150 bucks, and these kind of very large spends, that increases the likelihood of re-identification on average by 22%.
So I have a question. So, practical application of this. We have usernames and passwords.
Yep.
People hack them all the time. So just a few pieces of data, and we could identify the person who is accessing a system.
Yep.
Is this kind of practical application that we could imagine using this kind of?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the organic authentication is based exactly on the same principle, right? The idea that if I have enough data about you and the way you behave, very quickly I can learn what distinguishes you from 1.1 million other people. And so there's a lot of people looking at both the privacy impact of this and how we're going to start using large scale mobile phone, credit card, DNA, MRI data, right. And at the same time how can we use this to improve on the security front? And organic authentication is really a big one.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So that was all of this, and we started with anonymization is a two-step process. Pseudonymization, de-identification. You remove the direct identifiers, and basically you blur, you add noise, you do whatever way you want to make sure you prevent this little game of matching, which is called de-identification or anonymization. And the way you do that most of the time is through something we call generalization. Right? And generalization is basically you're going to take the zip code. You're not going to give me the 9-digit zip code. You're going to give me the 5-digit zip code, or maybe you're going to give me the region. You're not going to tell me the precise date of birth. You're going to give me the year, or you're going to give me age groups, and so on and so forth. And that was the second step is really to see the extent to which if you start blurring these pieces of information, you can prevent this re-identification. So we wanted to do the exact same thing with mobile phone data. In the case of mobile phone data, we don't need these complex graphs matching the zip code to regions and so on and so forth. Basically, what we did is we added nodes, right? We generalized. So instead of knowing that you were in this region of 1 kilometer square, we said that I know that you're in this region of 2 kilometers square, 3 kilometers square, 5 kilometers square, 15 kilometers square, and same thing the other way around the temporal axis. Right? I don't know that you were there between 10 and 11 a.m. I know that you were there between 10 and noon. I know that you were there at some point in the morning. Basically, what we wanted to do here is really to see the extent to which, I can add enough noise that this, little game of re-identification would not work anymore, or at least, that the likelihood of re-identification measured through Unicity will decrease enough. We took large-scale data. This is the only equation I have the entire talk, I promise, but it's a really important one. Basically, we took the data set, and then we wanted to see the extent to which, adding noise, blurring the data, actually prevents re-identification. And basically, what this tells you is that, as you would expect, decreasing the spatial and the temporal resolution of the data decreases the likelihood of re-identification, right? If you give me information that is less precise, there are going to be a lot more people that will be in this region of 15 kilometers square at some point in the morning than people that will be in a region of 1 kilometer square between 10 and 11 a.m. However, there's two issues. The first one is what this tells you is that it behaves as a power function. And what a power function means is basically you get decreasing returns. So it means that every time you take the data and you go from a resolution of an hour to a resolution of 2 hours, say that you gain 3% privacy. Unicity decreases by 3%. And then when you go from 2 hours to 4 hours, you only gain the same 3%. And if you want to again gain 3%, you go from 4 to 8. And this is true along the temporal axis. This is true along the spatial axis. So adding a little bit of noise at the beginning decreases the likelihood of re-identification, but very quickly, you have decreasing return, and you need to add a lot of noise to actually significantly decrease the risk of re-identification. Second issue is if you look at this equation, this little p, right, the number of points. And basically what this tells you is that this equation is completely dominated by the number of points. And basically in practice what it means is that you can take the data, you can add noise, but at the end of the day, for me to re-identify you, I only need to collect a few more points. And sure, you can add noise and you can say you only have this region of 10 kilometers square and so on and so forth. All it means is that I'll need a couple more points. It's not going to be 4, it's going to be 5, it's going to be 6, it's going to be 10. But very quickly, just by collecting a few more points, the likelihood of re-identification skyrockets and goes back to something above 90%. So really what this means is data anonymization, removing direct identifiers, trying to blur the data, might have worked in the past, might have worked when we were talking about small scale, CSV type data set, like the one I showed you at the beginning with income. Everything I showed you here today basically means that to us, in our opinion, data anonymization does not work anymore with big data. It doesn't work with the large scale behavioral data sets that we've been looking at and the large scale behavioral data set that you guys are working with. And quickly to conclude, I think to me what this really means, and I won't have time to go into some of the solution that I wanted to show you, but the main idea behind a lot of what we've been doing is that we should stop releasing this data. So historically, why did we anonymize the data? Is simply because in '95, we were collecting small-scale CSV-type data set and then sending them around on floppy disks. In today's world, 20 years later, there's this cool new thing called the internet, and we have much better way of doing things. And I think, one of the main solutions that we've been advocating for and working on to use these kind of large-scale data set in a way that, truly acknowledge the challenges and try to address them, is through API. And a lot of the work that we're doing now, and that I'm leading at Imperial College in London, is really to start building, proper IT infrastructure with the right security, with the right sandboxing, with the right, algorithm that will be run locally. The idea being to send the code to where the data is, not try to take the data, anonymize it, mess with it, try to make it okay, and then send gigs of data to someone's laptop. And so, moving forward, I think it's increasingly crucial to acknowledge the challenges. Trying to say that there's some kind of intrinsic trade-offs, saying that it will lead to a tragedy of the data commons to acknowledge the challenges. It's just misleading. I think there's a bunch of good solutions that exist to use data in privacy-conscientious ways, API being one of them, and really now is the time to start using them. Thank you.